Welcome back to our Pride Month specials, and this week we're talking Magnus Hirschfeld. Now, fair warning, this one is a bit intense. Hirschfeld was a prominent German LGBTQ researcher and advocate. He was born in Kolberg in Pomerania, now Kolzbreg in Poland. His father was a fairly well-known physician in town. He attended Kolberg Cathedral School, then studied comparative linguistics in Breslau before transferring to the Kaiser Wilhelm University, now the University of Strasbourg, where he studied medicine and natural sciences. And he bopped around in Berlin and then Munich. He did his state-mandated military service in Heidelberg and continued his medical studies there. And then he returned to Berlin to write his medical thesis on the effects of influenza on the nervous system. The examiners for his thesis defense were none other than Rudolf Virchow, the father of pathology himself, and then Emil Heinrich Dubois-Raymond, who discovered nerve action potential. So, a little bit of pressure there. But he received his medical degree in 1892. He spent the next 2 years traveling the world giving lectures and writing articles. He visited major cities throughout France, Algeria, Morocco, Italy, and the United States. He was in Chicago for the World's Fair, documenting it for a German newspaper, and he became absolutely fascinated by the gay subculture of the city. It was similar to what he'd experienced in Berlin. And so he developed this theory about the universality of gay subculture around the world and began to research subcultures in Rio de Janeiro, Tangier, and Tokyo. He returned to Germany in 1894 and opened his first practice in Magdeburg. And during his time in practice, he started to become more involved with the local gay community. He was struck by the number of patients who had engaged in self-harm, and so he became committed to gay rights advocacy to give his patients a reason to keep fighting. He was especially affected by the trial of Oscar Wilde in 1895, and he referenced it in his writings, including in 1896 when he lost a patient that he'd been treating for depression. The young lieutenant spoke to Hirschfeld in his note, saying, "The thought that you could contribute to a future when the German fatherland will think of us in more just terms sweetens the hour." And so, determined to accelerate his advocacy, he moved his practice to Berlin. He also published his first study under a pseudonym. Here he argued that homosexuality was biological, and quoting Nietzsche, he said that what is natural cannot be immoral. In 1896, the Great Industrial Exhibition of Berlin took place, and they basically had people from various colonies in sort of a human zoo. So that's disturbing. But Hirschfeld went and asked them about gay subcultures in their various cultures and began writing a survey of gay subcultures around the world. He would release this in 1914. In 1897, he formed the Scientific Humanitarian Committee with publisher Max Spohr, lawyer Edward Oberg, and writer Franz Joseph von Bülow. This society aimed to conduct research and repeal the law that criminalized homosexuality. This was paragraph 175. The motto of the committee was justice through science, reflecting his belief that a better understanding would eliminate social hostility. And he did eliminate a lot of hostility. He brought in over 6,000 signatures on his petition, including prominent people like Albert Einstein, Emil Zola, and Leo Tolstoy. Unfortunately, his inclusion of non-gender conforming people drove away some, like the noted philanthropist and volcanologist Benedict Friedlander, and unfortunately his bill failed to gain public support. It was only supported by a small minority of the Social Democratic Party when it was brought before Congress in 1898. Despite the failure of his bill, he continued to advocate for gay rights. He was the first to present statistical evidence that gay men were more likely to engage in self-harm, and he collected evidence to argue for social reform. He also engaged with other social causes, like in 1905 he joined Bond für Mutterschutz, or the League for the Protection of Mothers, believing that there was a close connection between women's rights and gay rights. Now, being a prominent gay Jewish man, he really struggled with German identity. He often was not considered a proper German. And so at the start of World War I, he initially wrote a lot of nationalist pamphlets which drew a lot of criticism. But by 1916, he turned critical of the war, criticizing the suffering and trauma and calling for an end. And following the November Revolution, he co-wrote a pamphlet with his sister on the women's right to vote. He also co-wrote and acted in one of the first movies to ever portray a homosexual character, called Different from the Others. This aired in 1919 and ends with him striking out paragraph 175. Unfortunately, this was a dangerous time to be a gay man in Germany. In 1920, the Volkisch had started to pop up in German cities, and Hirschfeld was beaten on the street. Regardless, by 1921, he became known as a global expert on gay rights. And under the post-World War I Weimar Republic, he was able to establish his own research institute. And with the dawn of universal suffrage in Germany, Prussia became a social democrat stronghold. So during this time, they ceased enforcement of paragraph 175. Prussia became a haven for gay rights, and Hirschfeld's institute proved a haven for both research and clinical medicine. Unfortunately, he was never able to get paragraph 175 repealed. In 1930, the chancellor was overthrown and a conservative Catholic was installed, and so paragraph 175, which had been on the books but not enforced, was put back into effect. So Hirschfeld began to travel abroad more often on a speaking tour. He was also looking for a safe home, coming to the conclusion that Germany would continue to become more hostile. And he was right. In 1932, Franz von Papen carried out a coup that deposed the government of Prussia and appointed himself commissioner. In 1933, the Hirschfeld Institute was sacked and the books were burned, closing the institute forever. They revoked his citizenship and he took up a life in exile in France. He passed away in exile from a heart attack in 1935. Not only was he a major advocate for gay rights in Germany, but he inspired similar organizations in the United States, including the Society for Human Rights in 1924 and the Mattachine Society in 1950. And in 1892, a group of West Berlin activists opened the Magnus Hirschfeld Society. This society continues his work and has tracked down what's left of his records.